I thank the Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Utah for hosting a forum here on the floor for our colleagues to be able to talk about the important issues with respect to Bidenomics, such as you can even use that term as anything other than creating and inflicting pain on the American people through a big spending, highly regulatory, inflationary environment that's killing the average hardworking American family. That's the truth. My colleague from Utah brought a number of our other colleagues down to make that point very clearly, in addition to making the point that, and the point that I've come to the floor of the House to underscore and reiterate, and that is the importance of the United States of America standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder with our friend Israel. We are not. That's the plain and simple truth. We are not standing side by side with Israel at a time when she most needs it. 3 days ago was April 7th. That marked the 6-month time frame since the brutal attacks of October 7th. October 7th in Israel has become, much like we describe, September 11th. As we know, Hamas, through both what's publicly available and those things that we have seen privately, in terms of the information available and the videos that we've seen and the horrific slaughter of human beings in Israel, Hamas slaughtered children, raped women, burned whole families alive, and took hundreds of innocent civilians hostage. An estimated 1,200 Israelis were killed on October 7th. Those numbers are still numbers that we're trying to track down. An estimated 130 hostages of the initial estimate of 250 are still believed to be held in Gaza. To be very clear, that includes Americans. Americans are right now being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. 91 Israelis are dual citizens, 8 Thai nationals, 1 Nepali, 1 French Mexican, but 6 Americans. 6 Americans. But instead of unequivocally backing Israel and backing the fight against Hamas, a United States designated terrorist group, I want to be very clear, the Biden administration has been undermining Israel every step of the way. Last November, on the floor of this body, the People's House, the representatives of this body passed, on a bipartisan basis, funding for Israel. We did so immediately. It is something I'm proud of. I am not shy to criticize members of both sides of the aisle for the shortcomings of the People's House. But we came together on a bipartisan basis and we passed, I think it was about $17 billion of funding for our friends in Israel just over a month after the vicious attacks against them. That bill would have funded their needs, shown that we would stand next to Israel, and importantly, it was paid for. It was paid for out of the expansion of the Internal Revenue Service, which most recently was found by the IRS's own Inspector General to have 63 of the additional of the audits that were added are for people who make less than $200,000. 63% of the audits or for people who make less than $200,000, which, by the way, is what we said would happen if you expand the power of the IRS, that the average American, the average hardworking family would get targeted by the bureaucrats of the IRS, but our Democrat colleagues and the President of the United States, a Democrat, radical progressive Democrats, are choosing the Internal Revenue Service, are choosing to target you, the hardworking American family, are choosing to side with Hamas over Israel. That's what's happening. So instead of America standing up together, united, and standing right alongside Israel, our Democrat colleagues in the administration and in this body and in the Senate give lip service to standing with them and instead are trying to undermine them. Again, I want to be very clear. Republicans in the House passed off of this floor with Democrat votes legislation that would fund Israel, that was paid for, so we're no longer just spending money into oblivion, by taking away some of the increased expansion of the IRS that the IRS's own Inspector General has acknowledged and reported is being used to target hardworking middle-class families. That's the truth. That's the distinction. But it goes a lot further than that. The Biden administration is trying to tie the hands of Israel. They're taking active steps to undermine Israel. Biden, the President Biden told reporters that Israel's military operations in Gaza were, quote, over the top, and the bombing was, quote, indiscriminate. President Biden told protesters, quote, I've been quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza. And I'm using all that I can to do that. That is the President of the United States. On March 25th, just a couple of weeks ago, President Biden's representatives at the United Nations green-lighted by abstaining instead of voting. By abstaining instead of voting on a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire without any connection to the release of hostages. Can you imagine the leadership of our country where they could have a veto exercise in the United Nations Security Council, chose not to exercise that, abstained, walked away, refused to stand up, and in essence, turned their back fully, not just on the nation of Israel, but on every Jewish American who knows family and friends and their heritage connected to the great state of Israel. This president and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle turn their back around on Israel. That's the truth. There is no debate on that truth. It's literally what happened. Now, by the way, the administration is all too happy to continue to throw billions of dollars to the United Nations. And this is when I give a little wake-up call to my colleagues on this side of the aisle for continuing to fund a government at war with our people and at war with our values by giving more funding for the United Nations. But it is this administration that is throwing money at the United Nations. I think this last bill we just moved was $3.5 billion. Let's keep in mind that the United Nations General Assembly, that paragon of virtue, has passed 153 resolutions condemning Israel. 0 on China, 0 on Cuba, 0 on Turkey. I could keep going down the list, but 153 resolutions condemning Israel. Anybody with eyes can see what is happening. The Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, was correct when he said, quote, just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Every member of Congress, the President of the United States, every member of the Senate, we should be standing up shoulder to shoulder, backing Prime Minister Netanyahu, backing Israel with their unequivocal right to defend themselves, their unequivocal right to root out Hamas from the hostile forces that have been attacking them, and to not allow the international community to gaslight the world into saying that Israel is slaughtering civilians, because it's simply not true. The press and the international community will throw out numbers of the casualties in Gaza, but what they don't tell you is that a large number of those casualties are in fact enemy combatants. They are literally operating like divisions, like a military, but they hide because they're cowards. Because Hamas are cowards, and they hide under schools, and they hide under hospitals, and they build tunnels all through the city, all through the streets, making it as hard as it has ever been in the history of warfare for a sovereign nation, Israel, to defend itself against evil terrorists embedded in the civilian communities right underneath the streets in Gaza. But what's amazing is that what will be studied for years to come is the extent to which Israel has bent over backwards, has worked to minimize the casualties. I don't have the most recent data, but I would tell you that it's something in the zip code of, I think 19,000-ish casualties of civilians and about 13,000 terrorists or enemy combatants. If you don't know how ratios work out in the world of combatants, this is actually an historic low. History will judge this as an extraordinary feat by Israel to attack those who levied the most heinous attacks on their people and are holding hostage, I will remind people, 6 Americans. History will view this as an unprecedented success in modern warfare to root out and target evil and try to avoid civilian harm. Just to give you an example, I just told you that it was roughly 19,000 civilian casualties to about 13,000 enemy combatant casualties. Okay, 19,000 civilian casualties to about 13,000 enemy combatant casualties that I believe the data reflects that we see going on in terms of Israel and their engagement with Hamas in Gaza. Here's a point of reference. According to the United Nations, civilians usually make up around 90% of casualties in war, which would be a 1-to-9 ratio. I mean, think about that. Think about the extent to which that is what the United Nations, that paragon of virtue that has had 153 resolutions condemning Israel. The United Nations says that ratio is normally 1-to-9. And Israel's got it at something in the zip code of like 1-to-1.5. While you have the enemy not marching in a line of redcoats, not getting in the field and just marching at you as the enemy combatants, but hiding as the cowards that they are in the tunnels, under the schools and the hospitals and the businesses and the communities in Gaza. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this chamber and in the Senate should be ashamed of themselves, as should the President of the United States, for walking away from Israel, going to the United Nations, abstaining from your role in the Security Council to stand aside Israel, while buying into the nonsensical lies about what Israel is doing when they're actually doing probably the best job in the history of humankind to root out and target the enemy combatants and the terrorists who are embedded in the communities of Gaza. It's an extraordinary feat. It is something we should hold up as a model of success and then stand alongside Israel. And what we should do is send over the $17 billion that we already passed off the floor of the House and sent to the Senate, which is paid for by shrinking the IRS. An IRS, which is already pointed out, is targeting hardworking American families, as the Inspector General of the IRS noted. Seek the truth. Figure out what's really happening. I noticed that my friend from Maryland has joined me. I've been talking about the extent to which we should be standing alongside our friends from Israel, and would be happy to yield such time as he shall consume to my friend from Maryland.